Hello and welcome back to the internet. It's Friday the 13th and we are getting close to Halloween season. So I think it's time we take a look at some scary stories. From Ask Reddit, what is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Now just as a disclaimer, I'm not going to be trying to keep these ones PG like I usually do. So these stories will likely be getting pretty disturbing, so just a heads up. I would call it creepy more than scary. But my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things. A batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day, she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters, small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops, who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs to help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is that they got to know each other throughout the ordeal, and the guy was actually very respectful, just down on his luck. She didn't press charges, instead let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy stuff with a happy ending. You know, I've often wondered if I ever became homeless, if I would ever try actually squatting somewhere. I think it would be scarier as the person trying to sneak in, because you have no idea if you're going to get caught and what they might do to you if they catch you. The Nyshaba train disaster is something that reminds me of how death can come at any moment. A train with 51 wagons of sulfur, fertilizer, petrol, and cotton wool somehow broke loose and rolled down the track about 20 kilometers until it derailed in the town of Khayyam, Iran. There were no humans on board. Chemical leaks ensued and authorities tried to extinguish whatever fires broke out. At one point, the whole thing explodes, and it really explodes. The whole town of Khayyam is literally demolished. 3 nearby towns are badly damaged, and it was heard 70 kilometers away. The wreckage continued to explode for several days after. Around 300 people died, and more than that injured. An earthquake of 3.6 on the Richter scale was produced. Well, I don't really know that much about the combination of things that were on board, but apparently they didn't go so well together. My mom was driving, and a guy ran out into the road, so she stopped so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them, luckily, and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't locked, who knows what would have happened to her. I've heard of lots of incidents like this, where people will hide around in the woods, they'll throw something out into the road, or cause somebody to stop or get out of their car, and that's really just how they bait the person to stop and so they can go, do who knows what. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible, back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out, as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he'd plowed through. The car ended up the right way up, and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord. Wow, that's pretty crazy. I had no idea you could survive and be that close to dying. Before my dad died, he once told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He told me about a mission where he and one other American, with 5 CIDG strikers, which were South Vietnamese villagers turned fighters, were tasked to emplace seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. He said they were about 2 days into the mission, when he and 2 of the strikers split off from the main group to go watch a nearby trail intersection. He said the jungle was pretty quiet that day, just the sounds of birds and bugs and an occasional monkey. He said that he had been watching the trail intersection for about 3 or 4 hours, and were deciding on whether to move further down the trail or to turn back and link up with the rest of the patrol. Before leaving the cover of the brush, my dad said he'd checked the trail ahead of them one last time, and prepared his men to move. Now here's where the story gets interesting, and he told this part with absolute dead seriousness. He said, just as he started to step out onto the trail, he sees a light-skinned, black Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear laying alongside the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad said the Union soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a short curved club at his hip. As my dad was trying to process what he was seeing, the soldier looked directly at him and smiled. Then the soldier slowly placed a finger up to his lips, as if to tell him to be silent, and then motioned my dad back off the trail. My dad said he signed for his men to remain hidden, and he recalled that as he slipped back into the jungle on the side of the trail, the Union soldier did the same on his side of the trail. Less than 10 seconds later, he said the lead element of a group of NVA, which were North Vietnamese Army soldiers, walked right through the trail intersection some 30 feet away. My dad estimated that the group was comprised of some 70 to 80 soldiers, equipped with automatic rifles, light machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He had no doubt that his entire team would have been wiped out on the spot. He said as soon as the enemy soldiers had passed, he and his team beat feet out of there and as fast and as quietly as they could, and rejoined with the rest of the patrol. He reported the enemy soldiers his team had encountered, but decided not to say anything about the soldier he had seen. My dad kept this secret for many years, only telling me just before he passed, and earlier only telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. He said that when he told his grandmother, she smiled and without opening her eyes told him, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather. He was a half-black, half-Creek free man who was a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served with the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a Creek war club into battle. You know, it's been a long time since there's been any major world wars out there, and I think that over time we've kind of forgotten how scary war can really be. I mean, most of these stories, you'd be terrified if you had one killer that was after you. Just imagine being in a country where there were thousands of them. So I work at a max security prison, and we have several inmates who are severely mentally ill. The ones that self-harm wear a Fitbit kind of thing to monitor heart rate. If there is a change, we rush to their room to stop whatever is happening. On top of this, we also do visual inspections. On one round, a coworker was doing cell checks, and noticed this particular inmate had blood on their face, but nothing came up on the monitors or anything. So he called the inmates to ask if they were okay. The inmates had their eyes closed and just kept repeating, "It doesn't hurt." The inmate would not answer where his blood was from. He opened the cell to see what the situation was, and it turns out the inmate had plucked out both of their eyes, and they were laying on the floor. The inmate's HR monitor never alerted, and the inmate never screamed. Paramedics said the inmate's vitals were normal, and the inmate was fully responsive. Well, that's a pretty gruesome way to try and take yourself out, but your eyes aren't quite vital organs. When my aunt was about 16, she was working at a grocery store, and had a boss in his mid-20s. One day, he called the house and was begging her to sneak out and hang out with him. She was considering it because it was her boss and she didn't want to say no. My mom, who is 2 years younger than her, always gets these incredibly spot-on gut feelings. She had one that night and begged my aunt not to go out with him. Thankfully, she listened to my mom and told him no, which made him really angry. He ended up going out that night and meeting another girl. He took her out to some cliffs and raped her and pushed her off. Somehow she lived through this and was able to get him sent to prison. I feel so sorry for that girl and so thankful for my mom and her gut feelings. Always trust your gut. I have heard of a lot of stories where people's gut feelings saved them. I really wonder how some people's gut instincts can really be that accurate. Not as scary as some of the stories here, but I was pretty horrified when my dad told me the story. There are some really big houses in the woods in my hometown. One of the owners went out drinking with his buddies and realized he forgot the key to the gate when he got home. So he decided to just climb the gate. While climbing in his drunken state, he slips and his leg gets pierced by one of the spikes on the gate. He was hanging there, but too afraid to call for his wife, since he was sure she would just open the automatic gate from inside the house, and since it was one of those gates that slides to the side, it would just rip his leg off if she did. He was hanging there the entire night until his wife woke up, saw him, and called the fire department. My dad, who was one of the firefighters that showed up, said they had to saw off the spike to get him off. Just imagine hanging from your own gate all night long and not being able to call for help. Well, at least he was in a place that he could be found. The worst ones are the people that just get stuck like out in the wild and never being found. A female friend in college disappeared from a party at another university in the city town 25-ish miles north of our school. She had arrived with another friend who I believe had driven. At some point, she split off to play cornhole or something and was later inexplicably gone. Phone calls went to voicemail. Police were called, but she was simply missing. About 10 days later, she was found by a homeless man who witnessed her crawling up to a bus stop in the city, begging for help. She had broken a leg and an arm, and was in very bad shape. At the quite large party, she had her drink secretly drugged, and was then led off by a group of men into their vehicle. She was taken to an apartment where she was drugged, repeatedly raped, and locked in a small room in between with a bucket to use as a bathroom. At one point, after being injected with heroin and raped, she somehow managed to convince one of her captors to allow her to use the actual bathrooms to clean herself up. The bathroom had a small window to the outside, and with the shower running, she managed to squeeze out and fell from the 3rd story into a large hedge. From there, she crawled from the apartment complex to the road and bus stop, where the homeless man saw her and called the police. Many cars stopped upon seeing her, making her captives unable to recapture her. 3 men were later arrested for the crime, after surveillance cameras allowed police to locate the apartment which she jumped from. She returned to our university almost 2 years later, graduated, and became a nurse. She was obviously traumatized, never partied again, carried a gun everywhere she could, and somehow moved on with life. It was a terrifying tale none of us ever forgot. She was an 18-year-old freshman when the incident happened. Have you guys ever seen or heard of the movie I Spit on Your Grave? In that movie, something very similar happens to this. A bunch of guys, do all these terrible things to a woman, and then they leave her for dead. But she manages to survive, and then comes back and just brutally tortures and murders each one of them. And in a way, it's kind of a satisfying movie to watch, because throughout the first part of the movie, you gain such a deep hatred for these characters, and then it's like you really want to see them get tortured. I hope that's what happened to the guys in this story, but they probably just ended up in jail for life. 100% true, as it happened to me. It was probably more spooky than scary. I'll let you be the judge. So many years ago, before there were cell phones, we had these things called pagers strapped to our hips. Someone would page you with their phone number, and you would call them back when you got to a phone. As an on-call technician, working in the audio-visual field, my pager would go off all the freaking time. Like most people who use pagers, our clients knew that if you followed up your number with a 911, that would indicate to the technician to stop what they were doing and call right away. Although I was always busy, I rarely, if ever, got 911s. One afternoon, traveling from Orlando to St. Petersburg via Interstate 4, my pager goes off with a number I don't recognize, followed by the 911. I find the first exit and pull into a little truck stop looking place outside of Plant City to use the payphone. This takes maybe 3 minutes tops. I walk in, ask for some change, and head to the wall where there are 4 payphones to choose from. I pop my quarters in and dial the number displayed on my trusty pager. It rings, and rings, and rings, and rings. I'm thinking to myself, what the heck? Who would page me with a 911 and not answer their phone? It's just about then that I notice another ringing sound in addition to the one in my ear. I pull the handset from my ear, and 2 phones over on the wall, another payphone is ringing, but with an incoming call. I hang up my handset, and the ringing stops on the other phone. I walk a few paces over, pick up the handset, and look at the phone number printed above the buttons. I looked at the number on my pager. I look at the number on the phone. I look at the number on the pager again. I look at the phone again. Except for the 911, they are identical. I kinda lose my breath for a second, and then I make my way over to the girl at the counter and ask if she saw anyone use the payphone. She said I was the only person in the store in the last hour. The whole episode probably took 15 minutes, but man, I was freaked out. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up, and I just wanted out of there. I get about 10 miles down the highway and come upon a scene that looked like a bomb went off. 4-car pileup involving a tractor trailer hauling a load of steel that had come loose. State trooper and paramedics just arriving. I pulled over to the side to help the best I could, but it was all pretty much over once it began. I have no idea why I got that page, or from whom, but what I'm convinced is that if I hadn't, I would not be alive to write this today. Man, these Final Destination stories are my absolute favorite. I love it when something so mysterious happened, and it has some crazy outcome attached to it too. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later, I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out in the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we were both scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out, while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked, and not expecting him to break in. Motel on Watt Ave, Sacramento. Man, this story sounds like it belongs more in my Entitled People videos. An old janitor from high school, friendly Ecuadorian man who went by Ping, worked at the school for 20 plus years and nobody had a problem with him. I guess his wife was leaving him, and in the process of moving out, he caught her in bed with her new man. The next day, in the middle of town, he opened fire on her, the man, and then killed himself before any cops had time to respond. You know, some people have very simple lives. They have very little to live for. And when they lose that little bit of life they have left in them, it's all over. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body is still in the cave. Yeah, this is why you should always keep people around if you're going to be doing dangerous adventures. This is why I like to keep my exploration a little bit more simple. Years ago, when I was 8, my family lived in this big, weird house, kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, My brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning, and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning, I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left, I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon, the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs, I looked and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door, and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months, I didn't tell my family because I was positive that what I had seen was a ghost, and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 or $900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights, trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I ever had. I hope that everyone watching is checking all of their closets and attics after watching this video. So this is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother, and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming in to 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. Man, it's always messed up when people feel the need to, take out other people on their way out. It's like, if you can't stand being a part of the world anymore, then go ahead and leave, but don't take other people with you. I told this here before, but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there'd be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noises, so he'd go out to look around but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property, but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he'd start calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing. So they told him that he needed to stop calling them for this, and perhaps get a security camera. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening, he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, i.e. without lights or sirens. And when they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that the people were shooting up in there. I always think it's odd, if you're looking for a discreet, hidden-away place to do something, why would you do it so close to somebody's house? Why not just go out into the wilderness or something? My dad and some friends got drunk and went out for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and this girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits. 2 of them died on impact, and the only reason the 3rd survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his legs and part of his arm, and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after to be a warning to all. Well, that's one way to scare kids straight about driving. I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at the bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow and smashed head-on to another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed a fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and say that there's been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think that this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and the heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. It was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten guy driving the other way was some rich, drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link to the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on a low HUD and Channel 12 News. Well, we're going to end it on that note, but this is only half the stories I pulled, so I'm going to have a part 2 for this tomorrow. I hope I didn't scar anybody too much from this video, but the world can be a pretty messed up place, so look out for part 2 tomorrow, and to thank everybody who's made it this far, I'll still be ending it with a cat video just to cheer you up a little bit. So, thanks for watching.